Thanks for joining us again. Another Program on Extremism webinar. My name's Alexander Meleagru-Hitchens. I'm the Research Director of the program. Today, we're going to look at assessing the threat of incel violence. It's a topic that has been in the news actually quite a lot recently. We saw in Toronto recently, Canadian government decided to charge the first ever person with incel terrorism. And also in Arizona just the other day, a shooting that has been in one way or the other linked to so-called involuntary celibates. A lot of questions about this movement, including if and how we can understand it as terrorism, its links perhaps with other types of more well-known extremism, particularly white supremacist or extreme right. To help us through some of these questions, we've got three great speakers. First, going to hear from Bruce Hoffman. He's the Shelby, Cullom, and Kathryn Davis Senior Fellow for Counterterrorism and Homeland Security at the Council on Foreign Relations, also a professor at Georgetown University's Security Studies program. He's going to look at essentially how the movement has evolved, its history, and also look at some of the trends that it perhaps reflects in terrorism, or rather current trends in terrorism the movement may reflect, including things like loose command and control or non-existent command and control structures, perhaps an ideological convergence among perpetrators and members. Then we're going to hear from Renske van der Veer, Director of the International Center for Counterterrorism. She's going to bring to bear her own academic background in narratology and gender studies. Particularly her analysis is going to use a lot of the kind of primary sources, particularly recent manifestos of shooters, and talk a little bit about what she's thinking around the type of targets and perpetrators within this movement or of this movement. I should also say that the ICCT is having an event very soon on the 4th of June, another webinar, 4 p.m. Central Eastern Time, 10 a.m. Eastern, on gender and terrorism and violent extremism. Today, we very recommend that you have a look at that. If you want to see more, go to icct.nl. And finally, we're going to hear from Jacob Ware, who is a research associate at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he's going to talk to us a little bit more about those links that incels may have with more established extremist movements. We're also going to have a Q&A for participants, and again, thanks a lot to all of you who joined. There's a Q&A option there at the bottom of your screens. If you put your questions in, they're going to be looked at by the admins and sent to me, and I will go through those later on. So we will have a good 20 minutes or so. Go ahead, Bruce. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Alex, and also to Lorenzo Vidino, the director of the Program on Extremism, for this opportunity. Both my remarks and that of my colleague, Jacob Ware, today derive from an article we published a couple of months ago in the scholarly journal, Studies in Conflict in Terrorism. It was written with a co-author, third co-author, Ezra Shapiro. Let me stress from the outset that both our article and our remarks today refer not to the entire incel community by any stretch of the imagination, but rather our focus is on an extreme militant fringe within that community that on occasion has used violence. It may help too to explain why I personally was drawn to this subject and enlisted Jacob and Ezra to work with me on it, based on the fact that they had done some previous research on this subject. Like many, I think I was inclined to regard the violence perpetrated within the context of inceldom by this extreme fringe as something that was sporadic, completely uncoordinated, and mostly isolated. I have to say this is one of the great benefits of being a professor, is you can learn from your students, and there was a superb presentation given in Georgetown Security Studies master's program about 13 or 14 months ago by one of our students that completely changed my mind. And it seemed to me, having reflected on that excellent presentation, that the handful of violent incidents we had seen over the past 6 years conformed to 6 broader patterns of violence that we were seeing unfold in the realm of terrorism. First, all of these these acts of violence considered by extremists in the incel community involved lone perpetrators, what sometimes the media has styled as lone wolves. I think lone actors or lone perpetrators is a much better phrase. Second, that these individuals were radicalized online and were part of an online community that was reliant principally on social media for their radicalization and drift towards violence. That they also variously advertised their attacks ahead of time on social media and then issued manifestos, often very detailed ones, explaining why they undertook the violence. And this will be familiar to all of you as patterns of terrorism we've seen repeatedly throughout the world over the past half dozen years or so. Fourth, they didn't belong, unlike some of the other patterns we've seen, to any kind of existing tangible organization with an identified leader or any kind of a command and control apparatus, which is a phenomena we've also seen with some of the mass shootings in Christchurch and El Paso and in Poway and Pittsburgh in the United States. Fifth, like many lone actors in recent years, they used a variety of readily available, in some cases commercially accessible, weapons, firearms, in some instances including assault weapons, but also far more mundane weapons, knives and machetes, for example, and in a few instances, vehicles that were used as part of a vehicular type of ramming homicide. And then finally, as FBI Director Christopher Wray recently noted, the boundaries that once existed between domestic and international terrorism seem also to have been blurred with this community and to have gone, in the first instance, from the United States to Canada, now to the United Kingdom and potentially elsewhere. Let me emphasize again that we are talking about fewer than a dozen incidents, with, as Alex just mentioned, the latest tragic one having occurred just last week in Arizona. Nonetheless, these incidents have accounted for over 50 fatalities, which when you averages out about 8 deaths per incident, which generally speaking is on the high end of terrorist lethality when we look at terrorism incidents generally. And finally, what drew us to the subject too is, although there's been many excellent journalistic accounts and analyses and profiles, Jacob and I and Ezra were surprised to find that the scholarly literature on this was pretty thin indeed. There was an excellent article written in the journal Terrorism and Political Violence a couple of years ago, but it was hard pressed to find scholarly material on this. And then finally, from a personal dimension, having written and studied and thought about what is terrorism and what isn't for many decades, having seen yet another example of the imprecision of this term in the past few weeks, where the New York Times, in an obituary of someone who had been a victim of radical left-wing terrorists in the 1970s and 1980s, in the headline and in the body of the article, they called that terrorists, they called them terrorists or terrorism. But then a few days later, there was an article about that tragic attack on a maternity ward in Afghanistan that used terms like militants and assaults. So to put this violence in context seemed also quite important for us. The focus of our research was thus on this online community of individuals who assail what they believe are the social injustices wrought by genetic determinism and female preferences that have relegated them to the margins of society and therefore have led, again, in some extremist fringe circles, to the advocacy and encouragement of violence. As some of you know, the term incel is a contraction of the words involuntary celibate. It actually takes its name from a website that was created in 1993 by a young female undergraduate at Canada's Carleton University, which she eponymously titled Alana's Celibacy Project. It and many other sites at the time simply aimed to give individuals an outlet for expressing frustration. And more than that, also, this one in particular sought to provide support for individuals who were, for want of a better term, romantically alienated or frustrated by their experiences. The early sites were populated by men as well as women. And an incel was seen as certainly someone who hadn't had sex in at least the past 6 months, despite having tried. But as we've also seen, as the internet culture developed during the 21st century, and especially over the past decade or decade and a half, the term incel and the extreme fringes of inceldom developed its own unique culture. in which many of these forums began to reflect views that were becoming much more strident, much more radical. And these more militant views coalesced around three common themes that we've seen prevalent. First, viewing society as a caste system that was determined by sexual attractiveness, where women made decisions about sexual partners based entirely on physical appearance. Second, that the status of persons who self-identified as incels in this gradually growing more militant way was immutable because of their physical appearance, their height, their stature, critically their ethnicity. I think contrary to popular misconception, these are not all young white males. It's stretched across a variety of individuals with sometimes mixed racial heritage and different backgrounds and different religions as well. And then thirdly, there was a belief that these individuals would be perpetually relegated to this lowly position so long as women had the power to choose partners. So the difference between, say, these 21st century articulated grievances that acquired a much sharper and harsher edge, and the earlier ones, let's say, of the late 20th century, when Alana had started her website, was a conclusion that was often articulated that it was incumbent upon those embracing the label or the self-identification of incel to act, and to act decisively, to take control of their lives and basically exact revenge for the dismissive and derogatory way they felt that they were being treated. And the foremost exemplar of this new trend was a 22-year-old named Elliot Rodger. On May 23rd, 2014, Rodger stabbed 3 of his roommates to death before embarking on a vehicular homicide and shooting a rampage in Isla Vista, California, which was a suburb of Santa Barbara, where the University of Santa Barbara is located. And in total that day, he killed six persons. Rodger thus became the first self-identified incel to go beyond the violent rhetoric that was circulating in cyberspace at the time and translate thought into homicidal action. He explained his attack in a lengthy manifesto titled Day of Retribution, and expressed the belief that his acts of violence were meant both to punish women, but also to inspire imitation and emulation amongst others. He published numerous videos, for instance, on YouTube, some of which you can still find, that further articulated his sense of alienation and indeed his anger at being rejected by and his hatred towards women. After the shooting, some of the more militant and extreme incel forum users praised Rodger's attack and spoke themselves of the desire importance of following in his footsteps, as it were, of carrying out similar acts. And such praise, as it turned out, would be prophetic. Now, admittedly, the incel worldview, especially as articulated by this extreme fringe, is not obviously political, which makes its classification very difficult. But at least in our research, because of the core ethos that this extreme fringe articulated, because those ethos revolved around the subjugation and repression of a group of persons, because its violence was designed to have far-reaching societal effects. In this sense, many of the attacks that we saw between 2014 and recently began to conform to, as I said earlier, emergent trends that we were seeing more broadly in the field of terrorism, and in many instances also had a very salient hate crime dimension to them. And in my view, hate crime is the ultimate form of terrorism. In fact, an assessment by a Texas law enforcement agency from just this past January concluded what begins as a personal grievance due to perceived rejection by women may morph into allegiance to and attempts to further an incel rebellion. close quote, which I think validates the fact that this movement was becoming much more political. In order to understand it, Jacob and Ezra and myself, after actually months of discussion and various iterations over drafts, basically divided incel violence into 4 key categories, which I think is one of the contributions that the article makes in enabling us to better conceptualize this trend and this community of violent individuals, and understand that there are very important nuances and differences. And the 4 basically, which I'll briefly discuss before concluding, are: the first category, clear incel motivated attacks. The second category are attacks with mixed motives that evidence incel ideological influences, but are not carried out specifically in the service of militant incel ideology. Third are acts of targeted violence perpetrated by self-professed involuntary celibates. In other words, that are not framed within the militant incel community ideology, but after the commission of these acts, these individuals claim this was their motivation. And finally, what we termed post-facto inceldom. Very briefly, let me just unpack the 4. The clear incel motivated attacks, the first category, is arguably the most important, because these are attacks we concluded that are acts of political violence with explicit political and ideological aims committed by individuals who profess to be part of this broader militant extremist community. Obviously, Elliot Rodger is a clear example of this, as the first self-identified violent incel, someone who has become a touchstone, who's on occasion referred to as the patron saint of this militant movement. In other words, individuals that have declared an affiliation with and adherence to the most extreme fringes of this movement. And to date, there's been, in our view, 5 clear attacks involving this. The deadliest one, which many of you will be familiar with, was the attack in Toronto a couple of years ago by a 25-year-old named Alec Manassian, who drove his vehicle through one of the city's busiest streets, striking pedestrians, men and women alike, although 8 of the 10 victims were women. The second category are attacks with mixed motives that evidence incel ideological influences, again, from this extreme fringe. And this category embraces attackers who espouse or identify with the ideology and hence frame their violence within that context. I think for us, the distinguishing feature of this particular category is that these acts of violence, even though they claim some affinity with the extremism of incel, and in some instances, specifically Elliot Rodger, they don't seem to have been perpetrated for expressly political purposes or to further any kind of a militant agenda. Instead, they've just cited incel ideology as, in advance of their attacks, as justifying this violence. Christopher Harper Mercer, who attacked an Oregon community college, killing 9 persons, is one example. William Atchison, who murdered 2 students in a New Mexico high school, is another. And then, as many will recall, the tragic shootings at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, 2 years ago, that claimed 17 persons by Nicholas Cruz. I mean, each of these perpetrators had previously referenced some aspect of inceldom in prior online or offline postings. Many of them expressed outwardly a fascination with the ideology and perhaps even admiration for Elliot Rodger. But significantly, the attacks do not appear to have deliberately or specifically targeted women. Instead, each involved a college or a school, was open in its victims, and therefore seemed less political. Third, we have the category of targeted violence perpetrated by self-professed involuntary celibates. And here we draw a distinction between those on the militant fringe of the incel community who subscribe to an ideology embracing and advocating violence, and just individuals who, after they've carried out their attack, claim to be incels or claim to be involuntary celibate. An example of this, just to give one of several, was the attack last June in Sudbury Canada by Alex Stavropoulos, where he stabbed a mother in the neck in a shopping center, and afterwards claimed he really wanted to kill the woman's young daughter. There didn't appear to be any political motive to this attack or even a hate crime, but rather their acts of violence were predicated on profound misogyny and sexual frustration. And then finally, and I'll stop here, we have what Jacob and Ezra and I have termed post facto inceldom. This is in addition to these previous three categories, where the militant incel community, the fringe, has claimed previous acts of violence before the conceptualization of involuntary celibacy even existed, had inducted individuals responsible for these acts of violence into their community posthumously. So for example, Marc Lepin, Quebecois anti-feminist who murdered 14 women at a Montreal Polytechnic in December 1989, fits into this category, and someone like George Sodini, who killed 3 women in an August 2009 shooting in an LA fitness health club in Pennsylvania, would be another example of people not part of this community, but subsequently that were inducted into it. So let me stop there, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much, Bruce. That really helped shed some light on this, and kind of, especially with the categories, I think, adding some rigor to this kind of type of violence that in a way has reopened or, impacted the ongoing debate of how we understand terrorism, what is it, and how to define it. And this kind of touches on a couple of the ongoing problems and adds to our understanding. Go ahead, Ranska, thank you.
Thanks, Alexander. And thanks for having me. To be honest, this is a topic that is quite close to my heart. I guess I have a lot to say about it. I've been working in the field of counterterrorism for over 10 years now, as an intelligence analyst, as a policymaker, and now as a head of a think tank. But originally, I was trained in the field of gender studies, academically trained, and also in the field of narratology, which is basically the study of stories, in my case, specifically personal stories, autobiographies. And there is so much to compare and contrast between my former field of studies and the topic that we're discussing today, the topic of incel violence. But as I only have like 10 to 15 minutes today, I will limit myself. So allow me to elaborate on 2 takeaways from the research that I've been doing over the past couple of months, and I will be hopefully publishing in the coming few months. And those 2 takeaways are the following. The first being, we actually really have to listen to what these people have to say. And the second takeaway is men can be targets of incel violence too, and women shouldn't be ruled out as potential perpetrators of incel violence. So let me start with the first one. We actually need to listen to what these people have to say. In, I think it was 1993, Michael Kimmel wrote a famous essay called Invisible Masculinity, and in it he stated that men are the invisible gender. And he argues that even though there is a dominant male discourse in literature and in other texts, there is hardly any text, autobiographies as well, written on the actual experience of being a man in society, personal experience. And he argues that because of that, these men are actually not part of a tradition, of a history, making their gendered selves, in a sense, invisible. And when looking at what I call ego documents, so personal documents, for instance, those of men like Elliot Rodger, who Bruce just referred to, so basically texts left by men who have come to commit atrocities that they themselves claim that are the consequence of their perceived insignificance as men in society. These are then texts that have no tradition, no discourse, and they don't have a theoretical framework for analysis. So when studying these documents, these ego documents, be it a self-titled manifesto or a police interview after an attack, or forum postings online or on message boards, for instance, So personal texts of people who have gone on to commit acts of violence from an ideology that is so based on gender stereotyping, like the incel ideology, it is really useful to apply the framework of methods and insights that was devised within the realm of gender studies. For instance, those used to study female autobiography. This is useful to try and gain more insight into the actual role of this perceived illegitimacy in their drivers towards violence. These perpetrators, by their own words, feel marginalized. They feel illegitimate. So combine this with living today, in the world as it is today, where stereotypical roles are changing. In my opinion, that's a good thing. It's not quick enough even. But traditional male entitlement, in a sense, is no longer a given, at least not everywhere. And vice versa, traditional female roles are no longer all defining for women's potential. But this can, in some instances, create a situation of inner conflict. For instance, for those who define themselves on the one hand side as marginalized and subordinated, as incels often do when you listen to what they have to say, but at the same time feel a sense of entitlement, whether it is to power, relationships, or sex, as male incels have stated that they actually feel entitled to. And in our times, when there is cultural and societal shifts going on that in a way erode these privileges that particularly white males used to benefit from, this intensifies this inner conflict. And all of this, I think, is enough reason to actually really try to understand this as well as we can, also when we think about incel violence. So when analyzing the ego documents of people, men up until now, but more about that later, who have committed violence linked to the incel movement, we should make sure that we use this source material, these ego documents, to its full potential. And this includes actually listening what they have to say about themselves, about their position in society, about the reasons that they came to commit their attacks, who and what they wanted to target, but also indeed about these feelings of illegitimacy and these potential inner conflicts. The actual narratives and voices of these perpetrators are sometimes, I've noticed, dismissed in a sense as relative material for study, sometimes on the basis of the premise that they either deserve more audience because of what they've done is so horrific, and sometimes also because these voices are dismissed on the basis of the fact that these people are easy to label as mentally ill or unstable in a sense. And these reactions are understandable, particularly considering the horrific nature of their acts. But dismissing the voices of these men in analyses by labeling them as mentally ill or confused echoes what we have seen in the traditional female autobiography studies, where it's quite commonly known that, for instance, personal stories of women who could be labeled unstable in many ways were met with significant suspicion. And this kept people from understanding the effects of perceived illegitimacy on these women and of the ways they acted out on that for quite a long time. So I argue that this is also the case, in a sense, with the personal texts left by perpetrators of incel-related violence, sometimes because of the mentally unstable label, but sometimes I think also unintentionally because of analysts' own biases. I've had that myself as well. And in order to make most use of these texts, we should overcome, I think, our, very human resistance to these perpetrators' voices and listen to what they have to tell us and analyze it. We need to make sure that we don't mold their words into our own biases, which in the case of analyzing this phenomenon of incel violence is particularly hard to do, as it is a theme that is so closely linked to personal and societal perceptions of gender, of masculinity, of femininity. And all of us are in one way or another personally involved in this or affected by this. So it's difficult. So close reading then, and that brings me to my second point to take away, which was men are victims too, can be victims, are victims too of incel violence, and women cannot be ruled out as potential perpetrators. So if we close read the actual words of incels, like those in the writings of perpetrators that they have left behind, like Elliot Rodger has done in his text, or for instance, those in the lengthy interview with Elliot Rodger that he had with police officers after his arrests, we can't really deny that there are some differences, some nuances to be seen if we compare their own take of their belief systems and their intentions to the current description of the incel movement in academic discourse and in mainstream discussions. I think most notably, there is this seemingly prevalent notion that only women are victims of incel violence, and that women are not considered to be potential perpetrators of this type of violence. And first of all, it seems like we in general have accepted that incel violence always targets women, and thus that only violence aimed at women can be labeled incel violence. But it doesn't just target women, it also targets men, and it also targets society on the whole. I do think it's good for me to underline that by no means I want to underestimate or deny the misogynistic views that many male incels have. And I definitely don't want to contend the fact that violence driven by misogyny should be taken very seriously. But if you look at two often discussed cases of incel violence, incidentally, the ones that were referred to by Bruce as well, the case of Elliot Rodger and the case of Elliot Rodger, let's do that. And in line with my earlier plea, let's actually look at their own words for a minute. I think I can share a screen here to get the quotes up for you guys. I hope this is going to work now. Is this working? It is. Okay, good. Right, well, Rodger describes pretty clearly who he wants to punish by his attack in his autobiography, if you want to call it that way, the text at least that he left behind after his attack. And he basically says he wants to punish all people who are sexually active. And this is interesting, I think. It is also something that Dr. Julietta Cook, who is a fellow at the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism, the IRMS, has written on too. And she contends that incels have a hyper focus on purity, not just towards individuals, but also towards society at large. Their violence is not aimed at just controlling women, but on controlling sexuality in general. And if you look at what Rodger actually wrote, and I'll quote, "It was all fueled by my wish to punish everyone who is sexually active, because I concluded that it wasn't fair that other people were able to experience sex while I have been denied it all my life." It's quite clear then that Rodger does not only want to target women. This is not the only time he refers to it like this in his document, by the way. There's others here on my sheet, but there's many more in the document. Let me pick one more. When he reflects on the actual attack plans, he says, "The first phase of his attack then will represent my vengeance against all of the men who have had pleasurable sex life while I've had to suffer." And then he goes on saying, "In the second phase, it will represent my war on women. I will punish all females for the crimes of depriving me of sex." So it's not just here, women, it's also men. When we look at the case of Elliot Rodger, who had a lengthy interview with the police after his arrest, he quite clearly states that his attacks was actually aimed primarily on men. He refers to his deed as an incel rebellion, and when asked, he describes what it is as follows. "It's basically a movement of angry incels, such as myself, who are unable to get laid, and therefore we want to overthrow the chads," with which he means the men who he thinks are more attractive and more prone to actually having sexual intercourse than he. And later on in the interview, when the officer asks him, "So who were your targets?" he states pretty plainly, "All of the alpha males." The officer asks him again, "So the alpha males, do you mean the chads?" And then he says again, "Yes." These accounts to me make it quite clear that these men did not just target women because they could not have relationships with them. They targeted both men and women. Rodger even, in a sense, primarily targeted men. And limiting ourselves in our definition of incel violence to those incidents of violence that target women then is some way problematic. The same goes for limiting ourselves thinking that only men are incels and only men could act out based on their worldviews. There's a growing community of women as well who self-define as incels. The male incel community does not accept this fact. They don't accept that women can self-define as incels because it doesn't fit their worldview. in this worldview, women can always have relationships. They can always have sex, no matter what they look like. So in their opinion, women can never be involuntarily celibate. They can only be voluntarily celibate. But nevertheless, women who define themselves as incels, and they often refer to themselves as femcels, they adhere to the same belief system as their male counterpart. They classify society in terms of attractiveness, and they feel that they are at the far low end of that scale, leading to an inability basically to have relationships and to have sex. And even though these fringes, the fringes of these communities, the female communities, seem less aggressive than the fringes of the male incel communities, it is unwise to rule out the potentially dangerous effects inceldom can also have on women, because it has the same radicalizing potential. We live in a time and an age where not only stereotypical male roles are changing, but women too. They are more and more able to create room for themselves, for agency and for ambition. And this growing agency means that there is room for anger, which is a good thing because anger is healthy. Female anger should by no means be seen as pathological in any way. But the fact that women, like men, can and do get angry and can act out on that makes it too easy to conclude that femcells are not able or capable of violence. As their male counterparts, they are. They're vulnerable to radicalization in radical communities, and the fringes of these feminine communities are also radical, at least part of them. Aggression is visible in these communities, in postings online, for instance, and I picked out two here. Femcells, for instance, celebrate the growth of male suicide rates, as you can see here in the first quote. But there's also discussions going on where femcells object to the pressure that they feel to only forgive and be positive. A young woman here, for instance, states, "I want to be as angry as I can. Hearing I just have to be positive and forgive brings me so much additional anger." So we should not treat potential aggression or violence towards others from women who self-identify as incels as an unknown unknown. It's a known unknown, and we shouldn't ignore it. I do think that these women in general are less likely to commit violence than men, as men in general are more likely to commit violence than women. But however, ruling out women as potential perpetrators on a somewhat biased assessment of agency and anger, and for that matter, not including them in the discourse on inceldom is, in my opinion, unwise. Which leads me to my concluding point. It is extremely difficult to overcome our own gender biases when analyzing a phenomenon as incel violence, a phenomenon that is so very closely linked to perceptions of gender in society. I've seen voices in this discussion keen to come up with analyses that, in my opinion, focus too much on the incels are targeting women side of things, if you like. Potentially from a very understandable need to underline the necessity to take violence against women seriously. And I will admit here that I had exactly the same urge when I started my research in this topic too. And it took me quite some distancing, actually, from my own prejudices and my own biases, and quite some self-analysis as well to stay objective there. And I've also seen bias from the other side, people underestimating the threat that these people pose, possibly linked to a more widespread underestimation of the effects of misogyny, for instance. But I would like to assert that incel, in principle, is a gender-neutral term, and it refers to a life circumstance that causes pain, and it causes anger. Anger that can and does lead to violence, also violence towards the self, abuse, hate crime, and in extreme cases, even terrorist violence. But the term is gender-neutral, and I think that the definition of the phenomenon should have the same quality. So baseline, this phenomenon needs a very conscious gender-neutral approach. And one of the ways to support such an approach is to actually listen to what these perpetrators, but also the people involved in the incel movement, including women, have to say themselves. And their own words tell us that both men and women can be and are also targeted by incel violence, and that women also self-define as incels and can act out on it. And I think I might be overstepping my time now, so I will leave you with this, and very much looking forward to any questions that anybody might have.
Thanks very much. Really useful and kind of original take there. And I think, sometimes to really understand groups and whether or not we understand them as terrorists, looking at the targets is very important. component of that, as well as, of course, their own words. But analysis of targeting is often a very important component of understanding the groups. Thanks very much. Go ahead, Jacob. You got about, just about 10 minutes. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Lorenzo and John and everybody at the Program on Extremism for having me, and thank you to Bruce and Rensky as well for your comments. I'm going to speak briefly about incels and their relationship intermingling with the far right. Before beginning, I'd like to repeat some of the disclaimers that Bruce made at the start. I think firstly, like any extremist movement, there are vast differences between the broader community and those few who actually end up committing violence. So nothing that we say about individuals who have committed acts of terrorism in the name of the incel community should be taken to brush the whole movement. And secondly, many of the ideological trends that I'll discuss here aren't uniform. They float in and out of various incel forums, and they're often argued upon within the chat rooms themselves. With that said, I'm going to talk about three particular themes within incel chat rooms that signify a rapprochement with more traditional recognized far-right ideology. Those are anti-feminism, anti-Semitism, and racism. And I'll then very briefly discuss some counter-terrorism implications. So firstly, incels broadly despise feminism, arguing that more progressive policies towards gender equality are the root of many of the globe's problems, as well as their own. Part of this anger is the product of individual loneliness, but the other more ideological factor is male incels' argument that the society has become an oppressive matriarchy. Incels often describe their ideal world as traditional, family-oriented, and reactionary views often permeate incel discourse. For example, though it's not inherently a far-right worldview, you often see incels yearn for the quote-unquote old days, where men apparently had more control over women, monogamy was the norm, and it was allegedly easier to find a spouse. Feminism, they say, has robbed incels of a right to wife and sex, which some incels then seek to redress through violence. And understanding the role that male sexual frustration and so-called aggrieved entitlement can play in political and public violence, as well as the role of gendered narratives in incel radicalization, is critical to understanding this violent fringe. Secondly, whether or not they're specifically intrinsic to actual incel ideology, racial themes are pretty much inextricable from the incel narrative. For example, you read Elliot Rodger's manifesto, it's a thoroughly racist document. At one point, he bemoans an African-American friend's sexual prowess by comparing himself to British aristocracy and comparing their acquaintance to slaves. Similar racist discourse with no direct connection to the ideology also appears prominently on forums where different races, for example, are ranked based on their perceived attractiveness to women, as well as the possible, hopelessness of their futures. And then in an age-old white supremacist slur, interracial couples are particularly despised, where the white girls are portrayed as driven only by thoughtless sexual desire, and the non-white men are portrayed as driven by criminal bestial lust. Finally, many incels also rail against Jews, and though this isn't necessarily a part and parcel of the cultural narrative, the classic anti-Semitic refrain about Jews controlling society through government, banks, and the media is relatively common among incels on forums identifying the causes of social decay. In fact, several of the perpetrators of incel-related violence that Bruce discussed also professed vehemently anti-Semitic views. For example, Scott Bailey, who was a Category 1 in Bruce and I's ranking, he murdered 2 women at the Tallahassee hot yoga studio in 2018. He'd been referred to by an old social group as Nazi Scott. And Nicholas Cruz, who murdered 17 students at the Parkland, Florida high school, had actually carved swastikas into his magazines that he used on the day of the murders. To illustrate the point with an example in Europe, several far-right attackers there have displayed incel tendencies, whether in public statements or in their online profiles. And I'll give one example. The perpetrator on October 2019, shooting at a synagogue and kebab shop in Halle in Germany, confessed to his crimes by claiming that immigrants had stopped him from getting a girlfriend. He also described himself as a quote-unquote loser and a quote-unquote disgruntled white man, and he cited feminism as the cause of declining birth rates in the West in his live stream. And these are all typical themes in the incel mindset, narrative and ideology. Several European far-right terrorists' repetition of common incel refrains, while they're not necessarily indicative of those individuals' membership in the movement or the community, point to an increasing convergence between the radical right and incel communities, particularly online, as well as the enduring role that sexual frustration and loneliness can play in sparking political violence of all ideologies. So why does this happen? Why the rapprochement? Well, Bruce and I have argued that over the past several years, the far-right online communities have noticed incel rhetoric's racial and men's rights undertones and have thereby sought to deepen ties between these movements. Opposition to feminism is often seen as the kind of the gateway between the two extremisms. Basically, once you accept that you're oppressed by women and a society that rejects you, it becomes far easier to claim or accept that you are also oppressed by other races and that society rejects you because of Jewish or leftist plots to suppress white men. Social media and online communities are particularly dangerous because they can seduce and pull in individuals who do not initially share that ideology. Social media and the algorithms embedded on social media sites can drag vulnerable individuals into internet rabbit holes where they become exposed to increasingly radical material and extremist interpretations of their grievances. There they often develop double lives, unbeknownst to friends and family. For example, in a March 2020 survey of the incels.co forum site, over 50% of respondents claimed that nobody in the real world knew they were incels online. Many incels cite simple loneliness and rejection as a motivating factor for first exploring the forums, but loneliness isn't necessarily a precursor for extremism. Social media algorithms can inadvertently guide such users into extremist communities, in turn fueling radicalization and ultimately weaponizing an individual's search for belonging. Incels and far-right adherents now openly and regularly intermingle on sites including Reddit and 8kun, and we've seen this manifest itself in attacks. Alec Manassian, for example, posted a pre-attack message on an alt-right 4chan image board. The ongoing rapprochement is important for two reasons. Firstly, both incel and far-right terrorism has manifested itself in lone actor attacks from Isla Vista, California to Christchurch, New Zealand. So as you increase the number of possible adherents, you also increase the likelihood of individuals committing attacks in the name of either ideology or both. Secondly, and more positively, as the extremisms come together, single counter-terrorism policies are increasingly likely to successfully blanket both. So any new policies to counter either violent incel or far-right terrorism should have both extremisms in mind. In our recent paper in Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, Bruce and I, along with our co-author Ezra, lay out several possible counter-terrorism responses, and I'd like to focus on two: countering violent extremism programming and social media regulation. So first of all, any successful strategy to counter the possibility of increased lethal incel terrorism will require devoting more energy and resources to community initiatives to counter violent extremism. The incel movement, I think, is so dangerous because of its accessibility. Incel radicalization takes genuine pain and real loneliness and converts it into hatred, anger, and in rare cases, violence. Learning how to better intercept incel radicalization while the individuals are still in those pain and loneliness stages is critical and an urgent imperative. Alana, who Bruce mentioned, the young woman whose online forums in the 1990s introduced the involuntary celibate concept, recently founded a group called Love Not Anger, an organization dedicated to pushing back against incel hatred by addressing the abject loneliness across the forums. Supporting and encouraging such initiatives is crucial. To be clear, there's nothing inherently wrong with a group of young people who have trouble finding love and relationships forming online support groups. But the ongoing vilification of a targeted outgroup with extreme rhetoric and violent suppression presents a grave danger. It harnesses real sadness and frustration, turns it into hatred, and focuses it in harmful directions. And the best way to prevent incel terrorism, I'd argue, is to undermine incel ideology in the first place through rehabilitation, insulation, and protection from new extremism. This must include dramatically improved access to mental health resources for young people online, while continuing to break down stigmas inhibiting such intervention. Illnesses such as depression and anxiety run deep in the incel community, according to the surveys of people populating those sites. In the March survey I mentioned earlier, almost 70% of respondents claimed to suffer from depression, and almost 30% claimed to suffer from autism. These mental health issues also surface in the suicidal rhetoric often expressed on these forums. mitigating the proclivity to despair and suicide, and protecting vulnerable young people from falling into these rabbit holes could blunt what could otherwise become a self-fulfilling pathway to violence. Secondly, my last point is that both governments and the technology companies who provide these digital platforms must collaborate more and better to counter the spread of online violent extremist ideology. Although specific incel forums themselves are relatively well policed, posts on more eclectic sites, including Reddit, 4chan, and 8kun, continue to call for violence against women and minorities, as well as provide a location where extremist manifestos can be posted in advance of violent acts. Recent international efforts to counter online extremism include the April 2019 UK government's online harms white paper, meant to more effectively tackle threatening online content. And in June 2019, in the wake of a devastating far-right attack on 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern instigated the Christchurch Call, an international political summit to address online extremism and the role of social media companies in its propagation. The ensuing document has been signed by upwards of 50 countries. Now, in the US, stringent free speech laws make passing legislation to tackle online extremism much more difficult. But alternative measures have been suggested by journalists and scholars, CVE practitioners, and politicians, including the GW program on extremism. For now, a broader conversation is needed on how to push back against extremism and violent ideologies online, and we need tech companies, terrorism experts, governments, and even former extremists and young social media users to contribute to that discussion. More effectively addressing the role of the internet in empowering incel mobilization is a critical priority, and challenging violent incels' online sanctuary would concurrently degrade far-right ideologies and their spread online as well.
Thanks, Jacob. I think it's this question of when you look at the incels, you sort of the instinct is that they kind of fit hand in glove with some types of extreme right thinking. It's pretty reactionary, anti-liberal thought, and I guess, and you think you helped explain some of that. And I'll kick off the Q&A just by asking you and the rest of the panel. Have you had exact instances where you've had members of the community, and perhaps community is a better term than movement, I don't know. I know I used movement early on, but yeah, maybe I'm just splitting here. There are members of this that are overtly not extreme right. So have you seen examples of people who are, say, openly left-wing or other types politically, who are nonetheless incels? Have you seen anything like that?
I've seen jihadists on incel forums. So yeah. It's, as I said at the start, these are trends that float in and out. They are things that some forums believe more strongly in than others. For example, if you go to Gab and read incels on Gab or Telegram, you're more likely to run into more hardcore far-right ideology. Whereas incels.co, a public forum which is easily accessible and tends to be less vicious in its rhetoric, you see a broader range of ideologies. So, my remarks, I think, indicate a trend that we've seen over the past several years, but it's by no means at all uniform across every single incel. We see lots of variety.
Right, and without wanting to go down another rabbit hole, it doesn't surprise me that jihadists would be on there. Fairly similar views about how the shape of at least society should look when it comes to traditional values and position of women, so it doesn't surprise me too much. So I'll read out some. Go ahead, yeah.
I mean, in that list of a half dozen or so trends patterns that we're seeing in terrorism generally today, I left out one. I mean, I'm sure there are others, but one that really goes to the heart of your question and what Jacob was saying is that increasingly, again, not universally, but increasingly we're seeing this phenomenon of ideological convergence or ideology hopping, where persons from other diametrically opposed views are finding common cause. The FBI has described it in those terms, and they refer to someone named Nick Young, for instance, who was convicted of providing material support to ISIS some years ago, but also saw himself as a neo-Nazi as well, and saw Adolf Hitler, for instance, as one of his idols, and various Salafi jihadis as the other. David Gartenstein-Ross, for instance, has written about this also in Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, and described it as fringe fluidity. So this is, I think, something, again, it's not pervasive or universal, but it's significant that we're seeing this convergence or compounding or combinations of ideologies amongst violently inclined extremists.
Great, thanks. I'll just run through a question. We've got a few minutes. Kurt Braddock, who I'm assuming is Kurt Braddock, whose book is out now, I believe, Weaponized Words, an interesting, very interesting looking book, asks any of the panelists, in your research, do you see any patterns that distinguish which incels turn to violence versus those that do not? Are there contextual variables that act as push factors to guide some of them towards violence? Any of the panelists? Renske, if you want to go.
Yeah, obviously I don't have a definite question here because it needs a lot more research, but what I've noticed, to be honest, is that people who I have seen who have violent tendencies, and you can also see it in these primary texts that I've been citing, these guys, at least, they have been hardcore gamers. And there is, in a sense, a form of gamification going on in the attacks that they've committed. If you look at the words, for instance, that Alec Manassian used when he told the police officer about the people who he killed, he talked about converting the status of the living to the status of death, instead of just basically telling I killed people. So his whole lingo and his whole thinking process was very much gamified. And I have a feeling that the isolation of people basically hiding and isolating in the world of online games, it's also something that Elliot Rodger actually said in his manifesto. I couldn't take life. I was creating a new life for me in the World of Warcraft world. I think that has something to do with it. It isolates people. It is very violent. It sort of distances people about sort of the humanity of others. It dehumanizes what you see in front of you when you commit an attack. So I have a feeling, but I have not researched it properly, that that might be a catalyst.
All right, thank you. Anyone else on that one? Sorry. Can you characterize the incel movement as a whole? How large is the extreme or violent portion of the greater incel movement? What tools do you use to obtain this understanding of the movement? Again, anyone on the panel?
I'll jump in quickly just to say, I think it's tough to gauge how large the movement is or how large the community is, partly because, you know, as it continues to spread and ideologically converge with other movements, it moves to a variety of different forums, different social media apps. So it's difficult to kind of get a feel of that. But I think the violent fringe is small, and even today, when you look at incels.co forums, the number of people who commit attacks or who support those who have committed attacks is small on those forums. It's very difficult to get into the more public ones, or the more private ones. Sorry, for example, on Gab, Telegram, it's more difficult to kind of embed yourself on those. So it's tough to say, and it's tough to say how many are really ever planning something like this.
Thank you. Last question again from Kurt. This is particularly for Renske. Great talk. I agree that we need to listen to incels' own words to help understand inceldom. One difficulty, though, is listening to what they have to say without legitimizing even their nonviolent viewpoints, which are still based in male privilege entitlement. Would you have any advice for the terrorism studies community on how to pay sufficient attention to their grievances without giving the impression that the misogynistic and entitled elements of the incel ideology are somehow okay, in inverted commas?
Yeah, I very much agree on the assessment of Kurt, that is a very real risk. You might have noticed in my presentation that I went out of my way to underline the actual fact that I do not condone misogynistic violence in any way. This has a reason why I'm doing this so explicitly, because of this risk that I'm running when I'm actually talking about the subject in the way that I do. I do think that if you actually are able to have a properly neutral stance on this, that helps as an analyst. If you are the neutral voice, the voice of reason there, who balances, and it is a balancing act, who balances, this risk that you're taking of potentially functioning as an echo chamber in a way, balancing it right with the actual necessity of getting the information out there that we need in order to counter this movement. If you're neutral enough, you can balance it, but it's very difficult. And I think, and this is actually contrary to what I've been doing today, I don't think you actually need to echo the words in order to incorporate what these words can teach you in your thinking. So that is where you can actually balance it out, right? I think, in a sense. But I have to say that I myself was hesitant to actually publish on incels, particularly in the beginning of this discussion, because I didn't want to call too much attention to the phenomenon, because it can have a snowball effect and it can actually attract people to the movement. But that is something that we've known of, I think, in the terrorism debate for a long time. So difficult advice: use your neutrality, don't echo when you don't need to.
Great, thank you. That's just our time, actually. Thanks again to all the panelists again, Bruce, Renska, and Jacob. If also, I just want to remind you again of the event that ICCT is having soon on the 4th of June, icct.nl for more on that. Also tomorrow, we'll be having another panel discussion. This time I won't be the chair, I'll be the subject of it. It'll be about my book coming out, which has come out in the US on Anwar al-Awlaki. So we're gonna have a book talk on that tomorrow. I might as well plug that, and any more on that if you want to see on Twitter @GWUPOE is our account, and you can get more on that there. Thanks again to everyone. See you later. Cheers.